I've always felt that one of the best ways to learn just about anything is to reverse engineer something that already exists. And that way you could really see how something was created and, more importantly, learn from that particular experience. That certainly applies to editing vector paths. Now what I've done here in this file, it's called editing points, and you'll find it in chapter 5 of your exercise files, is I've taken just a regular letter B from a typeface, and I've converted it to outlines or to vectors. And if I go ahead and I select it right now, you'll see that all the anchor points appear here on the path. Well, one of the first things I want to do is kind of, get an idea for where the anchor points are. Remember, one of the challenges of using the pen tool is just getting that feel or being able to anticipate where the anchor points belong on a path. So as you can see over here, the anchor points obviously are on the corners here. That should be easy enough to figure out. But also along the curve, see how there aren't like millions of anchor points here. They don't need to be. If the paths are built correctly and you're smart about where you position your anchor points, you can get away with using very few anchor points. And obviously the fewer anchor points you have, the more easy it will be to edit your art. Well, before we start actually editing this, let's make a few changes in the preferences that Illustrator has. Now, first of all, right now you can see that I have the ability to click on these paths, but I can only move the path as a whole, and that's obviously because I'm using the regular selection tool. Where to use the direct selection tool, I could now click on, let's say, one corner and then move that corner individually. I'm going to press undo there for a second here, and let's actually change some of the preferences. For the rest of this particular video itself, we're going to use the direct selection tool because we're going to be dealing with the parts of the path itself. Remember, the regular selection tool or the black arrow works with the entire path as a whole. We want to focus on the individual parts or anchor points of the path. So in that regard, we're going to be using the direct selection tool. And that also means that I don't see the bounding box here, which makes it easy for me to focus on these individual anchor points. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change some of the preferences inside of Illustrator because the anchor points themselves, I mean, when you mouse over them, they kind of light up a little bit like that. But we want to make it easier for us to work with these particular elements. So I'm going to go over here. I have nothing selected. I'm going to go to the control panel, open up preferences inside of Illustrator. I'm going to switch down over here to where it says selection and anchor display. Illustrator now has an entire preferences panel that's dedicated to dealing with just working with these anchor points and working with selections. So by default, Illustrator uses very small, kind of out of the way icons to identify these anchor points. And the handles are also pretty small as well. If you come from other applications like maybe CorelDRAW or Freehand, you may be used to anchor points that are much larger and easier to see and work with. And again, it's just a visual preference on what you like. If you work with a lot of anchor points, you might want to see a lot of big ones, but if you have a lot of anchor points very close to each other, they can overlap each other. So again, it's completely your own preference. But for now, I am going to choose, let's say, this option, which has much larger anchor points. And then for the handles itself, I'm going to choose larger handles. I'm not going to use the hollow diamond shape edges over here. I'm going to use just the regular round shapes here, but these circles are bigger than these. I'm also going to make sure that highlight anchors on mouse over option is checked, and that's when, before when I moused over just the anchor point kind of lit up a little bit, it got bigger, so that's the case there. I'm going to leave the tolerance at also to 3 pixels. That means that obviously as my cursor gets close enough to an anchor point, then I'm able to work with it. Depending on how good you are, how comfortable you are with the mouse, and what your precision is when you're working with your artwork, you may want to adjust that as well. But for now, I'm just going to leave everything else as it is, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Notice now, by the way, if I go ahead and I select the artwork here, you see that the anchor points are bigger, so you can see them. So the first thing to note is that, remember, just by clicking on a path itself, I've selected the path here, but Illustrator allows me to even select parts of a path without touching the anchor points. For example, I clicked over here, I could actually just drag this and it moves that segment of the path and the 2 anchor points that basically adjoin that particular path. But for now, we're going to be talking about the anchor point itself. If I do click on an individual anchor point, I can now select that one. Notice that this one is dark, but these are hollow. So that identifies that this is the selected one. And if I move over here, for example, I see that, oh, these are curved anchor points or smooth anchor points. Remember, we have different types of anchor points. But the nice thing, though, about Illustrator is that when you have an anchor point, you could easily switch between the modes of what that anchor point is. For example, if I have a corner anchor point, I could easily convert it to a smooth anchor point and vice versa. So let's first explore how we do that inside of Illustrator. If I'm using the direct selection tool, I can move an individual anchor point, as we just saw now. But if I want to convert, let's say, this smooth anchor point to a corner anchor point, how do I do that? Well, let's go ahead over here to the pen tool. And I'm going to click and hold my mouse button down. I'm going to use this tear off here, just so we can see all the elements that are kind of grouped with the pen tool. Now we have the pen tool, and remember the pen tool allows us to create new paths like we've been doing up until now. Then we have these 2 tools, which we'll get to in a minute. It's the Add Anchor Point tool and the Delete Anchor Point tool. But then we have this one over here called the Convert Anchor Point tool. And the Convert Anchor Point tool is the tool that we're going to use to convert anchor points from one type to another. For example, we can go from the corner anchor point to a smooth anchor point, or a smooth anchor point to a corner anchor point, or, as we'll soon see also, to create those combination points that we were talking about as well. So let's take a look at that. Remember how we use the pen tool. The pen tool, when we started working with the pen tool, we actually defined what type of anchor points we're using by how we used the pen tool. For example, if I knew I wanted to have a straight line using corner anchor points, I would click and release the mouse, click and release the mouse, and that would go ahead and create corner anchor points to the straight line connecting them. Now, if I wanted to create smooth anchor points, and hence create a curve, I would use the pen tool, and rather than just click and release, I would click and drag to pull out those handles, click and drag to pull out the handles, and that would give me the smooth anchor points and the curved line. Well, using the convert anchor point tool is going to basically work in the exact same way. So let's go ahead and just click anywhere here on this path here. Let's say I want to turn, like we said before, this particular anchor point here right now is a smooth anchor point. Let's turn it into a corner anchor point. I'm going to go to my convert anchor point tool, select it, move over, just hover right over that particular anchor point right there, and just click once. And because the same way the pen tool worked, when I just clicked once, it just made a corner anchor point. By clicking once on an existing anchor point with the convert anchor point tool, it will convert that to a corner anchor point. Let's do that again over here, for example. Maybe this one here. So now notice I have straight lines that connect all these particular anchor points. And again, this just really drives home that concept that I was saying before about how when you're using the pen tool and you're working with vectors, you're not really drawing the lines themselves. We didn't adjust or make the line straight. We just clicked on the anchor point, but by definition, by changing the type of anchor point that it was, the paths that connected those two anchor points changed automatically. So remember, when we're working with vector graphics, the all-important part of your graphic is the anchor point, not the path that connects it. So I'm actually going to say, hey, you know what? Let's say I made a mistake. I really want to turn that back into a smooth anchor point. Well, remember, when we use the pen tool, we click and drag to pull out those control handles. Well, again, I'm going to use my regular convert anchor point tool, click once on that, and drag out, and then that turns it now back into a curve. So for example, this is a corner right now, click and drag, that now becomes a curve. Now let's say I want to create a combination point. Combination point, basically, just to give you an example, if I go ahead and I adjust this particular control handle with my direct selection tool, you see how both sides of the path are affected. Well, if I take my convert anchor point tool, and I click on the control handle, not the anchor point, just the control handle, I'm able to make a change direction point or a combination point like we've been discussing until now. So now my path changes direction as it goes through that anchor point. Once I've done that, by the way, I can now use my regular direct selection tool to make that adjustment, and now the other sides no longer are part of each other. Now, when you're working inside of Illustrator, it's not easy to just keep dancing between all these different tools, the pen tool, the convert anchor point tool, so on and so forth. So again, it's important to understand the keyboard shortcuts that you have. When you're using the pen tool and you're working with a particular path, let's say, for example, remember, if I hold down the command key now, I'll go to the last used selection tool. Let's go ahead and use my direct selection tool. Click on the path, and I'm working, and let's say I have my pen tool and I'm drawing some paths here. If I hold down the option key basically toggles to the convert anchor point tool. So as I'm working with the pen tool, for example, I could decide to be drawing shapes and then realize, oh, I wanted to actually change that to something else. I could very easily just click and drag to basically pull out another point and then continue drawing in that way. And that way, what I've done now is while I'm drawing in the context of my self-drawing, I'm able to actually create a combination point or a change direction point right here as well. So remember, that's an important keyboard shortcut. Let's go back to this B right here, which is kind of looking a little deflated at the moment, but that's okay. We're learning how to edit anchor points here inside of Illustrator. So just a few other things as far as like adding or deleting anchor points to paths. Like let's say you decide you wanted to add a little kind of part that kind of sticks out, let's say right here on this part of the path here. How would you do that? Well, you would have to add another anchor point here. Now, if I take my pen tool, remember the pen tool is great for working with new paths, but if you have an existing path, you want to add an anchor point here. Well, normally you would not be able to use the pen tool here. But you'll notice, though, if I move my pen tool over the path, that little X right now changes to a plus sign. And it does let me add another anchor point there. And that's actually a great feature that Illustrator has. It's a preference, actually. If you go over here, I'm going to choose Illustrator Preferences. I'm going to go to General. And there's a setting here called Disable Auto Add Delete. And that setting called Auto Add Delete, which is right now is off by default, is what basically tells the pen tool that as you mouse over an existing path, maybe I would want to add a particular anchor point to that particular path. So that setting is on by default, so it automatically kind of figures out what I want to do. And then if I mouse over an existing anchor point as well, that plus sign changes to a minus sign, which means remove that particular anchor point. And now that anchor point gets removed from the path. And that, again, saves me from having to physically use the add anchor point or the delete anchor point tool. And let me explain to you why this is important, by the way. Let's say I want to delete an anchor point from a particular path. So let's say I don't like this one that's right here. Well, if I click on this and I press the delete key on my keyboard, it actually deletes the path segment. It doesn't delete just the anchor point there. I press undo. If you want to keep the path, but you just want to remove the anchor point itself, you would need to use the delete anchor point tool, or in this case here, just use the regular pen tool, mouse over that point until you see it turn into a minus sign, click, and then that gets removed that way. You want to add additional points, let's press undo. Let's add a point here, maybe add a point here. Let's add one more point, let's say right over here as well. Whoop, I missed the path there. You want to make sure you see that plus sign, click right there. Now I'll switch to my direct selection tool, and I'll pull just that particular path out, and that's I'm able to kind of make that somewhat different. So those are the ways that you could actually work with paths itself. There are some tools available in the control panel as you're working with paths to help you. For example, again, I'm using the direct selection tool. I'll highlight parts of the path here. Let's say these 3 anchor points that are here. If I want to remove just all those 3 and go back to a straight line, rather than have to click on each of these individually, I could go over here into the control panel. So there's an option here called cut path at selected anchor points, or remove selected anchor points. Now, obviously, cutting the path would be the same thing as if I had hit the delete button. Actually, it would turn them into separate paths that way to kind of break apart the path. But here what I can do is I can click on the remove selected anchor points. Those get deleted, and then the path just simply remains intact in that way. I also have a way, you'll notice when I click on a path itself, Illustrator only displays the control handles for the point that I'm working on or the path that I'm working on. Obviously, Illustrator only allows you to edit one control handle at a time. So it's of no use for me to see the control handle here when I'm working over here. However, there may be times just for me to be able to observe and see where these control handles lie. I could just marquee select a whole bunch of anchor points here, and then over here, this option here where it says handles, I could say show handles for all those, and now I can see all the handles that appear for those particular ones. One other little tip before we kind of close out on this particular video here is that I mentioned before how you could use the convert anchor point tool to actually convert anchor points from corner anchor points to smooth anchor points and vice versa. There is also a way to do that right from the control panel with these buttons right here. So this one is obviously a curve. I can click on that and convert it to a corner anchor point if I want to, and then go back to a curved anchor point as well. But I showed you before how you can do that manually using the convert anchor point tool as well. So that's just a nice little overview of how you edit all these anchor points and vector objects. And again, this is a knowledge that you'll need to have at a very core level when you start to get in and make little tweaks and changes to your adjustments. But as we'll soon see now, through the rest of this chapter, we're going to talk about working and editing with vectors that don't require this level of granularity. We don't need to go into the actual anchor points because we're able to start editing and working with paths from more of an object-based perspective that is a lot easier to basically get a grasp of. But when you do have time, I do suggest that you kind of, again, open up existing files, see where those anchor points are, play around with them. As you begin to get more experience with using them, you'll feel far more comfortable in editing these anchor points and vector paths.